if you were giving advice to Jordan Peterson going into the debate with Sam Harris, for example, what would you say would be the most fruitful lines of argument?
Well, I wouldn't presume to advise Jordan Peterson. He's a much more skilled polemicist than I am, and he's had much more experience, and in fact he seems to be on the road practically all the time. So I wouldn't presume to advise him at all. But my own approach with atheists is that to look at what they believe, because you see the normal stance is that atheists are on the attack normally. You believe in God, well, this is a very silly idea and it's led to all these problems, and people just become obsessed with violence to get their own dogmas across, etc. I mean, all those usual polemics, and think of the Inquisition, think of the wars of religion, think of Islamic terrorism and so forth. I mean, these are their usual points of view. Atheists normally put themselves in the position of the inquisitor. You know, here are all these people with silly beliefs. Here they are coming to it with reason and science on their side, and turning the spotlight of skeptical reason on these beliefs, which they think of as being completely devoid of evidence. And then they get the religious people on the defensive. That's the normal dynamics. But atheists are not people who have no beliefs or who've risen above belief. The great majority of them have a very strong belief system. They believe in materialism, the philosophy of materialism, mechanistic materialism, which they often think of as the scientific worldview. Well, the trouble with mechanistic materialism, it's a philosophy, not science, and it is itself a dogmatic belief system. As I show in my book, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in the United States, mechanistic materialism, the official belief system of science, and every atheist I've ever met has been a mechanistic materialist, so there are some who are not. Well, probably John Gray's not, but most are. They have a belief system that they think is science and is true, and that what they believe is true and what everyone else believes is just a belief. But actually, the mechanistic materialist worldview is based on 10 central assumptions, the first being that nature is mechanical, works as a machine, not an organism. In other words, it's inanimate and purposeless. And secondly, that matter is unconscious, that the whole universe is made of unconscious matter, and therefore there's no place for God, spirits or angels in nature, because the whole of nature, the stars, the galaxies, outer space, it's all unconscious matter. Well, these are assumptions. They're not facts, and they're not proven by science, and they're not tested by science even. They're just taken for granted. And in the 17th century, the philosopher René Descartes defined matter as unconscious, because he split the world up into unconscious matter and conscious spirit. Spirit consisted of God, angels, and human minds, which he thought were immaterial outside time and space. And matter was material inside time and space and unconscious. He made this distinction. In the 19th century, this Cartesian dualism was overturned by materialists who said, well, why bother with this untestable realm of God, angels, and human spirit? Everything's just matter. So they scrubbed out the spirit pole of Cartesian dualism, leaving the material pole as the only reality. And so God and angels disappeared at one stroke from this worldview. It's one stroke of the pen. They're just defined away. But this is an assumption. It's not a proven fact. And it's an assumption that Descartes made in connection with a dualistic model of reality, which has then collapsed down to a monism. And the result of that is that materialists and atheists are left with the problem of consciousness. It ought not to exist in a universe which is totally unconscious. If they define matter as unconscious, then consciousness shouldn't exist anywhere. Yet we know it exists in human beings. And that's why in the philosophy of mind it's called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is the hard problem. And so they then have to say, well, it somehow emerges from brains when they get complex enough. But how can something emerge that's something radically different from, or they have to say it doesn't really exist. Some of them say it doesn't really exist, it's an illusion. But that doesn't explain it, because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. It presupposes consciousness. Or some of them say it does exist, but it doesn't do anything. It's an epiphenomenon of the physical activity of the brain. But the point is that the very existence of human consciousness is a massive problem for materialism, and it's what's led to a whole burgeoning field of consciousness studies, a tremendous debate about the nature of mind. Many materialists are now jumping ship and have become panpsychists, saying that, well, actually there must be some kind of mind even in the simplest forms of matter, like electrons or atoms. Many materialists are now jumping ship and have become panpsychists, saying that, well, actually there must be some kind of mind even in the simplest forms of matter, like electrons or atoms. So it's not just in human brains, it's throughout all nature. There's a conscious side to nature. Well, then that's no longer materialism in its old form, it's something new. So what I think the question I'd ask Sam Harris if I were discussing it with himself is just how does he see and understand consciousness? And according to his book, Waking Up, he actually admits he doesn't know. He doesn't commit himself to a straightforward materialist position. He says that's his default position, but maybe there's more to it than that, but he doesn't say what. And that's the crucial thing in the whole debate, because what makes materialists and atheists different from everyone else is their belief that the whole universe is totally unconscious. All religions are based on the idea that there are forms of consciousness beyond the human level, that the universe comes forth from a conscious ground of being, that there's a sort of underlying consciousness of the whole of nature and of the whole of the universe, that our consciousness is part of a much larger system of consciousness. All religions take that for granted. Even Buddhism, which defines the ultimate state of being, nirvana, as extinction or the void, it's not the same as just material activities in the brain. It's a conscious state which is blissful, but beyond normal definitions, limitations and qualifications. So I think that if one has a debate with an atheist where one takes for granted that their assumptions are correct, that mechanistic materialism is a true view of reality as bound up with science, then atheists will definitely win any argument based on that, because they're taking the ultimate view of reality to be this materialist philosophy which excludes God and angels, and then you have to add them on as kind of quirks of the human imagination, or as phenomena inside human brains, or if you have the idea of miracles and God working in nature, you have to say, well, God then has to suspend the laws of nature and occasionally intervene. These are all preposterous views that are very unconvincing. And if atheists can force religious people into those kinds of views, then clearly theirs is a more rational position.
So you have to reframe the debate.
Yes, I think you have to reframe the debate, because it can't be taken for granted that mechanistic materialism is a true philosophy of nature. It's a philosophy of nature, it's a belief system, it's a worldview. So the atheists have a worldview, instead of not having a worldview. And I think a real discussion would involve discussing their worldview as well as a religious worldview on a level playing field, instead of putting the atheist in I mean, Dillahunty has the typical sort of, rather, he's not as bad as some. There's a kind of smugness about that. He says, well, we'll apply some skeptical thinking to this, and, you could benefit for a bit of skeptical thought. I'm totally in favour of skeptical thinking, In my own case, I apply this skepticism to the assumptions of science itself. I think radical skepticism is a very good thing. What I don't like is partial skepticism, where you take for granted your own beliefs and use this laser beam of skeptical thinking against everyone else's, assuming that your own are invulnerable. I think it should be applied to all belief systems.